Body of beautiful 11-year-old girl Carlie Brucia has been found. Joseph Smith is under arrest for the abduction and murder of Carlie.
On a quiet Florida afternoon, 11-year-old Carlie walked home like she had done so many times before, unaware that someone was already watching her. Within minutes, she would vanish, captured only by a grainy security camera that the entire country would soon see. Her last moments were not hidden in darkness, they were witnessed, and yet no one was there to save her. Carlie Jane Brucia was not the kind of child who faded into the background. She had a presence, bright, curious, and impossible to ignore. Born in 1992, Carlie grew up in Sarasota County, Florida, surrounded by people who described her as energetic, expressive, and deeply affectionate. She loved music, loved attention, and had that rare ability to make people smile without trying. At just 11 years old, Carlie was already forming a personality that felt larger than her age. She liked to dance, she liked to joke, and like many kids her age, she was still figuring out who she wanted to be, but she was doing it loudly, boldly, and unapologetically. Carlie lived with her father, Joseph Brucia, and was especially close to her family. Her parents were separated, but both remained deeply involved in her life. According to those who knew her, she wasn't just loved, she was protected, watched over, and cherished in the way only a child can be. She had dreams, even if they were still forming. Sometimes she talked about being on stage. Other times she imagined herself doing something creative, something where people would see her, hear her, and remember her. And people did remember her, not because of what happened later, but because of who she was before. Daily life, a childhood in motion. Carlie's life was structured around simple routines, school, friends, family time, the ordinary rhythm of growing up. She attended school regularly and spent time with friends in her neighborhood. Like many kids, she was beginning to gain small pieces of independence, walking short distances alone, visiting nearby places, learning the world step by step. That independence is something most families give gradually, carefully. And on February 1st, 2004, it was just another ordinary day. Carlie had spent time with a friend. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. At some point that afternoon, she began walking home. It was a familiar path, a safe path, at least it had always been. The community, safe. Until it wasn't. Sarasota County wasn't known for crimes like this. It was the kind of place where people believed children could still walk home safely, where danger felt distant, something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. That sense of security is what made what happened next so devastating. Because this wasn't a crime hidden in shadows. This was something else entirely. A presence in the background. While Carlie lived her life surrounded by love and routine, someone else existed in that same community. Someone whose life had followed a very different path. Joseph Peter Smith. At the time, Smith was 37 years old. To many, he appeared like just another man moving through the area, unremarkable, forgettable. But behind that ordinary appearance was a troubling history. Years earlier, Smith had been accused of violent behavior, including assault and attempted abduction. One woman, Terry Stinson, later said she believed he had tried to kidnap and possibly kill her years before Carlie's murder. According to her account, she only escaped by sheer luck. Another woman, Michelle Warner, had also accused Smith of a violent attack in the early 1990s, an incident that resulted in a relatively short sentence. Despite these warning signs, Smith remained free, living, moving, blending in. Carlie's last known moments. On that February afternoon, Carlie walked past a car wash. It wasn't significant to her, just another place along her route. But inside that car wash, a surveillance camera was recording. Grainy, silent, distant. And within its frame, something happened that would later shock the entire nation. Carlie appeared on the footage, walking. Then a man approached. What followed lasted only moments, moments that would later be replayed again and again on news channels, in courtrooms, in the minds of millions. Because for one of the first times in modern true crime history, a child's abduction had been caught on camera. Who was Carlie, really? It's easy in stories like this for the victim to become a symbol, a face on a poster, a name in a headline. But Carlie wasn't just the girl in the video. She was a daughter who hugged her father, a child who laughed loudly, a girl who had favorite songs, favorite moods, and favorite people. She was still learning how to navigate the world, still trusting it, still believing that the path home would always lead her safely back. The family. Waiting. When Carlie didn't come home, something felt wrong almost immediately. This wasn't typical behavior. This wasn't a delay. This was something else. Her family began to search, to call, to ask questions, and very quickly the situation escalated. Because when a child disappears without explanation, time becomes everything. The discovery of the footage. It didn't take long for investigators to uncover the surveillance video from the car wash, and when they saw it, everything changed. This wasn't a missing child case anymore. This was an abduction, clear, undeniable, terrifyingly visible. The footage showed a man grabbing Carlie and leading her away. No disguise, no attempt to hide, just brazen, calculated control. When the video was released to the public, it spread rapidly across television. Across the country, across the world, people watched it in horror because it didn't feel like something distant. It felt immediate, real, too real. A city holds its breath. As the footage circulated, fear spread through the community. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors looked at each other differently. Because now everyone knew whoever did this wasn't hiding very far. Somewhere in Sarasota, a man had taken an 11-year-old girl in broad daylight and left behind only seconds of video. But those seconds were enough. Enough to start a manhunt, enough to change a family forever, and enough to reveal something far more disturbing. This wasn't random. This was someone who had been there all along, watching, waiting. And now, finally seen. Before Carlie Brucia ever appeared on that surveillance camera, Joseph Peter Smith had already left a trail. Not a trail of bodies, but of warnings. Moments where something went wrong. Moments where someone survived. Moments that, in hindsight, feel less like isolated incidents and more like missed opportunities to stop what was coming. Who was Joseph Peter Smith? Joseph Peter Smith was born in 1966 in the United States. Compared to the brightness and warmth of Carlie's life, Smith's early years appear far more fragmented, though public records about his childhood remain limited. There are no widely documented accounts of extreme abuse or a single defining traumatic event that explains his later violence, and that absence is important. Because not all violent offenders come from visibly broken beginnings. Do some emerge quietly, gradually, without drawing attention, until they do? By the time he reached adulthood, Smith had already begun showing signs of instability and aggression. His behavior didn't erupt suddenly. It escalated over time, and it escalated around women. Early warning signs. One of the most disturbing aspects of Smith's history is how clearly some of the warning signs appeared, years before Carlie Brucia's abduction. In the early 1990s, a woman named Michelle Warner accused Smith of a violent attack. According to reports, he assaulted her in a case that resulted in criminal charges. He was convicted and served time in prison, though the sentence was relatively short. abcnews.go.com. This wasn't a minor incident. It was a violent act that placed him directly into the criminal justice system. But when he was released, and there was no permanent barrier between him and the public, no long-term monitoring, no system that tracked him closely enough to prevent escalation. A second chance, or a missed one. Years later, another woman would come forward with a chilling story. Her name was Terry Stinson. According to her account, Smith attacked her in what she believed was an attempted abduction. She later said she was convinced he intended to kill her, but she managed to escape. abcnews.go.com. This was not speculation from a distance. This was a survivor, someone who had looked directly into the face of the man who would later be accused of murdering a child. And yet, even after this incident, Smith remained free, living in the same world, moving through the same spaces. Pattern of behavior. When investigators later reviewed Smith's past, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was targeted. His aggression centered around control, particularly over vulnerable individuals. There's a consistency in offenders like Smith that criminologists often study. The behavior doesn't appear out of nowhere. It builds. First, smaller acts, then more serious ones, each step testing boundaries, each step pushing further. And if nothing stops it, the behavior escalates. Life before 2004. By the early 2000s, Joseph Smith was living in Florida. To those around him, he didn't stand out in any obvious way. He wasn't famous. He wasn't publicly labeled as dangerous. He blended in. And that's what made him so dangerous. Because people often expect threats to look like threats, but many don't. They look ordinary. They move quietly. They exist just outside suspicion. The psychology, control, and opportunity. Experts who later examined Smith's actions pointed toward a familiar psychological pattern: control, power, opportunity. These are often the driving forces behind predatory crimes like abduction. Not necessarily rage, not necessarily impulse, but a calculated moment where the offender sees an opportunity and takes it. In Smith's case, the prior allegations and convictions suggest that his behavior wasn't spontaneous. It was part of a pattern that had been developing for years. Each previous incident may have reinforced something, that he could act and survive the consequences, that he could get close to victims and escape, that he could exist within society without being fully stopped. The system, where it failed. One of the most difficult questions in this case is not just why Smith committed the crime, but how he was still able to. By the time of Carlie Brucia's abduction, Smith had already been convicted of a violent assault, accused in another attempted abduction, known, at least to some degree, by the justice system. And yet, he was not being closely monitored. He was not prevented from moving freely. He was not flagged in a way that would have protected the public, especially children. This isn't speculation. It's a documented reality that many observers, journalists, and legal analysts later questioned, because when a pattern exists and nothing interrupts it, the risk doesn't disappear. It grows. February 1st, 2004, the day begins on the day Carlie Brucia disappeared, while Joseph Smith was already in the area. At some point, he arrived near the car wash where the surveillance footage would later capture him. What he was doing before that exact moment remains partially unclear, but what is clear is this: he was there, present, positioned. And when Carlie walked into that frame, everything aligned. The moment of decision crimes like this often hinge on a single moment, a decision, a shift from thought to action. For Smith, that moment happened quickly. Carlie was alone. The environment was open, but not crowded. There were no immediate barriers, no one close enough to intervene. From a psychological standpoint, this is what's often described as a target of opportunity. But that phrase can feel clinical, detached, because what it really means is this: a child, walking home, crossed paths with someone who had already shown he was capable of violence, and in that moment, he acted. The intersection of two lives. Carlie's life and Joseph Smith's life had never crossed before that day. Two completely different worlds, one built on innocence, growth, and possibility, the other shaped by patterns of aggression, control, and escalating behavior. But on February 1st, 2004, those worlds collided, not by chance alone, but by a convergence of circumstances that had been building for years. Building tension. After the abduction, Smith didn't disappear. He didn't flee immediately. He remained within reach, which, for investigators, would become both a terrifying realization and a critical advantage, because the same footage that showed the crime also showed his face. Clear enough. Detailed enough. Recognizable. The public release. When authorities released the surveillance video, everything changed. People weren't just hearing about a suspect. They were seeing him, watching him, studying his movements. And in cases like this, public exposure creates pressure, because once a face is known, time becomes limited. Somewhere in Sarasota, Joseph Peter Smith was still moving through the city, while his face was now everywhere, on television screens, on police bulletins, in the minds of thousands of people searching, watching, waiting, and investigators were closing in. Because for the first time, this wasn't just a man with a past. This was a man caught on camera, mid-crime. February 1st, 2004 began like any other Sunday in Sarasota County, Florida. There was no storm, no warning, and nothing in the air that suggested anything unusual was about to happen. For 11-year-old Carlie Brucia, it was just another day. She had spent time with a friend that afternoon. It was routine, normal, safe, predictable. At some point, she began the walk back home. A short distance, a path she knew, a path she trusted. 3 p.m., a normal afternoon. Carlie was last seen walking along Bee Ridge Road, a familiar area not far from her home. The neighborhood was active but not crowded. Cars passing occasionally, businesses open, people going about their day. There was nothing about the environment that would immediately signal danger. And that's what made it so deceptive. Because danger wasn't visible. It was already there. The car wash. Along Carlie's route sat a car wash, unremarkable, functional. The kind of place people pass without thinking twice. But inside that car wash, a surveillance camera was running. It wasn't placed there to capture crimes. It wasn't designed to protect pedestrians. It was simply recording, quietly, continuously. And at approximately 6 p.m., that camera captured something no one would expect to see. The footage. The video is grainy, distant, silent, but painfully clear in what it shows. Carlie enters the frame. She's walking. Nothing appears wrong. Then, within seconds, a man approaches her from behind. He grabs her. There's no visible struggle that lasts long. According to investigators, the interaction was quick, controlled. The man, later identified as Joseph Peter Smith, physically overpowered her and began leading her away, not running, not rushing, walking, as if nothing unusual was happening, as if no one would notice. 4 minutes. The entire sequence lasts less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes, that's all it took. from the moment Carlie appeared on camera to the moment she disappeared from it. 4 minutes between normal life and something unthinkable. What the camera couldn't show. The footage ends, but the story doesn't. What happened after Carlie was taken is known primarily through evidence, investigation, and later court findings. It's not something that was witnessed publicly in the same way the abduction was, and it's important to approach this part with care, because behind every detail is a child. After the abduction, investigators later determined that Smith took Carlie to a nearby location. According to court records and forensic evidence, she was murdered shortly after being abducted. The exact sequence of events is documented in legal proceedings, but many public accounts intentionally avoid graphic detail out of respect for the victim and her family. What is known is this: Carlie did not survive, and the time between her abduction and her death was tragically short. The wait back at home, something was wrong. Carlie didn't return. At first, it may have seemed like a delay, a missed moment, a simple misunderstanding. But as time passed, concern grew. Calls were made, questions were asked, and very quickly, the situation escalated into something far more serious. Because when a child disappears, time doesn't just pass, it tightens. The search begins. Law enforcement was notified, and a search effort began almost immediately. Officers canvassed the area. Neighbors were questioned. Local businesses were contacted. And then, someone mentioned the car wash. Discovery of the video. When investigators reviewed the surveillance footage, everything changed. What had been a missing persons case instantly became an abduction investigation. Because there it was, captured in motion, undeniable. A man taking a child. The public release. Authorities made a critical decision. They released the footage to the public. This wasn't common practice in every case, but here it was necessary. The hope was simple. Someone would recognize the man, and quickly, because time was no longer on their side. National attention. The video spread rapidly. News stations aired it repeatedly. Viewers across the country watched in shock, because this wasn't a reenactment, it wasn't speculation, and it was real. A child being taken in broad daylight, and the man responsible, visible. Community reaction. Fear spread through Sarasota. Parents kept their children close. People locked their doors earlier. The sense of safety that once defined the community shifted overnight, because this crime wasn't hidden. It was exposed, and that made it feel closer, more immediate, more personal. A break in the case. As the video circulated, tips began to come in. People thought they recognized the man. Neighbors, acquaintances, individuals who had seen him before, but never imagined something like this. And one of those tips would lead investigators directly to a name: Joseph Peter Smith. Identification. Once Smith was identified as a suspect, law enforcement moved quickly. His prior record was reviewed. His location was tracked, and within hours the investigation began to narrow, because now they weren't searching blindly. They had a face, a name, and a direction. The discovery. During the investigation, authorities located Carlie's body. The discovery confirmed what everyone had feared. The search was no longer about rescue. It was about justice. Shift in the case. At that moment, everything changed. The urgency didn't disappear, but it transformed. From finding Carlie to finding the man responsible and bringing him into custody. Building the case. Investigators began collecting evidence tied to Smith, surveillance footage, witness statements, physical evidence linking him to the crime. Each piece added clarity. Each detail closed the gap. and the case against him grew stronger by the hour. By the time Joseph Peter Smith realized how quickly the investigation was moving, it was already too late. His face was everywhere, his past was catching up to him, and law enforcement was closing in. Because in a case where a crime was captured on camera, there was nowhere left to hide. By the time Joseph Peter Smith's face was broadcast across national television, the search for him had already begun to tighten. This wasn't a suspect hidden in shadows anymore. This was a man the public had seen, a man whose actions had been captured in real time. And that changed everything. The tip that changed everything. After the surveillance footage was released, tips flooded in, dozens, then hundreds. But among them, one stood out. Someone recognized the man in the video. Not vaguely, not uncertainly, clearly. According to reports, an acquaintance identified Joseph Peter Smith after seeing the footage on television and contacted authorities. That single call gave investigators something they didn't have before: a confirmed identity. And once they had his name, they had his history. Building the profile, law enforcement quickly pulled Smith's criminal record. What they found was alarming, but not surprising. He had prior convictions for violent behavior, including an assault case from the early 1990s. There were also previous allegations suggesting attempted abduction. To investigators, this wasn't a first-time offender. This was escalation. And now they had reason to believe that escalation had reached its most dangerous point. Tracking Smith. With Smith identified, authorities moved quickly to locate him. His known addresses were checked. His associates were questioned. Every possible lead was pursued. Time was critical, not only to apprehend him, but to understand what had happened to Carlie. And then they found him. The arrest: Joseph Peter Smith was arrested on February 3, 2004, just 2 days after Carlie Brucia's abduction. The arrest happened quickly, without the kind of prolonged manhunt that some cases involve. Because in this case, the evidence had already begun to close in. According to law enforcement reports, Smith did not resist in a dramatic or violent way during the arrest. But what mattered wasn't how he reacted in that moment. It was what investigators were about to uncover. The confession following his arrest. Eddie Smith provided information to authorities that led them to Carlie's body. This moment marked a devastating turning point. The search was over. The outcome was confirmed, and the case shifted fully into prosecution. While details of his statements are documented in legal records, it is important to note that confessions in cases like this are often part of a larger evidentiary picture, including physical evidence, witness accounts, and forensic findings. And in Smith's case, that picture was already strong. The evidence. Prosecutors built their case on multiple layers of evidence: surveillance footage showing Smith abducting Carlie, forensic evidence connecting him to the crime, his own statements to law enforcement, prior criminal history, demonstrating a pattern of violent behavior. This was not a circumstantial case. It was direct, visual, documented. Community response. As news of Smith's arrest spread, the reaction was immediate. Relief, because the suspect had been caught, but also grief, because Carlie was gone. The community that had once held its breath during the search was now faced with a different reality. Justice would come, but it would not bring her back. The charges. Joseph Peter Smith was formally charged with kidnapping, sexual battery, first-degree murder. These charges reflected the severity of the crime and the evidence gathered against him. And from the beginning, prosecutors made it clear they would seek the highest possible penalty. The trial. The trial of Joseph Peter Smith became one of the most closely watched cases in Florida at the time, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the video. The surveillance footage played a central role in the courtroom. Jurors didn't have to imagine what happened. They saw it, frame by frame, a child being taken, a man acting without hesitation, and for many, that visual evidence carried a weight that words alone could not. Courtroom moments. Throughout the trial, the prosecution presented a clear and structured case. They showed the timeline of events, the connection between Smith and the crime scene, the consistency between evidence and his actions. The defense, as in many cases, focused on challenging aspects of the evidence and raising questions about intent and mental state. But the strength of the prosecution's case made those arguments difficult to sustain, because this wasn't a case built on uncertainty, it was built on visibility. Or the other victims. During the trial and subsequent proceedings, Smith's past actions were also brought into focus. The cases involving Michelle Warner and Terry Stinson were not the central charges, but they added context. They showed a pattern, a history, a trajectory that had been moving in one direction for years. And for many observers, this raised a difficult question. Could this have been prevented? The verdict. In 2005, Joseph Peter Smith was found guilty. The jury convicted him on all major charges, including first-degree murder. The decision reflected not only the evidence presented, but the clarity of what had happened. There was no ambiguity, no reasonable doubt that could overcome what had been shown. Sentencing. Following the conviction, the case moved into the sentencing phase. Baffer prosecutors sought the death penalty, and after reviewing the case, the jury recommended it. Joseph Peter Smith was sentenced to death, a decision that underscored the severity of the crime and the impact it had on the victim's family and the broader community. After the trial, Smith was placed on death row in Florida. Over the years, like many death penalty cases, his sentence has been subject to appeals and legal review. This is a standard part of the judicial process in capital cases, but the conviction itself remains intact. Justice and its limits. For Carlie's family, the verdict brought a form of justice, accountability, recognition of what had been taken, but justice in cases like this is complicated because it doesn't restore what was lost, it doesn't rewind time. It doesn't return a child to her home. The man responsible had been identified, captured, and sentenced. The system had done what it was designed to do, but the impact of what happened on February 1st, 2004, did not end in the courtroom. Because beyond the verdict, beyond the headlines, there was a family learning how to live without someone who should have still been there, and a community forever changed by 4 minutes of footage that no one would ever forget. In the aftermath of the trial, when the courtroom emptied and the headlines slowly faded, something far more permanent remained. Not the case number, not the legal record, but the absence of an 11-year-old girl whose name would never stop echoing through Sarasota County. Carlie Brucia was gone. What in the world was left trying to understand what her life and her death now meant? A family left behind. For Carlie's family, the conviction of Joseph Peter Smith brought closure in a legal sense, but not in a human one. Her father, Joseph Brucia, and her extended family were left with something no verdict could repair, a life interrupted at its beginning. In interviews after the trial, the family described Carlie not as a symbol or headline, but as a daughter who filled their home with energy. She wasn't defined by the way she died. She was defined by how she lived. Loud laughter, sudden curiosity, a presence that filled rooms before she even spoke. After her death, her family focused on preserving her memory rather than the violence that ended her life. Her name became something to protect, not just remember. Community impact. Sarasota County changed after February 1st, 2004. It wasn't just fear, it was awareness. Parents became more cautious about allowing children to walk alone, even short distances. Schools and neighborhoods reevaluated safety protocols. Surveillance systems, once passive tools, were now seen as critical sources of protection and evidence. The car wash footage had proven something unforgettable. Violence does not always happen in darkness. Sometimes it happens in plain sight. That realization altered how many people viewed public spaces forever. The power of a camera. One of the most significant aspects of the Carlie Brucia case was the surveillance video. Before this case, many abductions relied heavily on witness testimony or delayed discovery, but here, the crime was recorded in real time. That footage became evidence investigation tool, public warning, and ultimately a catalyst for justice. It also changed how law enforcement and communities thought about surveillance systems, not as luxury technology, but as life-saving documentation. Changes in public awareness. Following the case, awareness around child safety increased significantly in Florida and beyond. The image of Carlie being taken became a symbol used in missing child alerts and safety campaigns. It reinforced a difficult but necessary truth. Predators do not always appear suspicious. They often appear ordinary, and prevention requires attention, not assumptions. The justice system question. Despite the conviction and death sentence of Joseph Peter Smith, the case raised difficult questions for legal experts and the public alike. How had someone with prior violent offenses been able to remain free in a position to reoffend? Why had earlier allegations not resulted in longer-term monitoring or intervention? These questions did not change the outcome of the case, but they did influence broader conversations about repeat offenders, sentencing structures, and supervision after release. In many ways, Carlie's case became part of a larger discussion, not only about punishment, but about prevention. The limits of justice. Even with a conviction, the justice system could only respond after the fact. It could not restore what was lost. It could not reverse the timeline. It could not return Carlie to her family. This is one of the most difficult truths in cases like this. Justice can be delivered in a courtroom, but it cannot undo reality. Remembering Carlie. Over time, Carlie Brucia became more than a name in a case file. She became a memory preserved by those who knew her. Her family spoke of her love for dancing, her expressive personality, and the way she could shift the atmosphere of a room simply by entering it. Those who knew her personally often emphasized the same thing. She was not defined by tragedy. She was defined by life, a short life, but a real one, full of movement, emotion, and presence. The national impact. Nationally, the case became part of a broader conversation about child abduction and public safety. The surveillance footage was widely circulated in media coverage, not for shock value alone, but as a reminder of vulnerability in everyday environments. It influenced public awareness campaigns, law enforcement training discussions, media reporting standards for missing children cases, and it reinforced a growing reliance on technology in modern investigations. What the case revealed. Beyond the crime itself, the Carlie Brucia case revealed several uncomfortable truths. Danger can exist in familiar places. A child walking a known route was still vulnerable. Prior warning signs matter. Smith's criminal history raised questions about missed intervention opportunities. Visibility changes outcomes. The surveillance footage directly contributed to identifying and capturing the suspect. Communities change after trauma. Safety perceptions shift permanently after high-profile crimes. The finality of loss, years after the trial, there is no evolving mystery in this case, no unknown suspect, no unanswered forensic question. What remains is final. A child left a home and did not return. A community witnessed it unfold, a country watched the evidence, and a family learned to live with absence. Carlie Brucia's name continues to be remembered not because of how her life ended, but because of how clearly it was seen, captured in motion, frozen in time. A moment that forced thousands of people to confront a reality they did not want to believe. She was a daughter, a child, a girl who was walking home. And in remembering her, the story does not belong to the man who took her. It belongs to her. Carlie Jane Brucia.